All right, so today we're going to be talking a lot about the Enlightenment ideals in the Declaration of Independence. We have three main assignments that we're going to work on this morning. The first is our warm up, then we have the 1.4 notes, which we're about to go through, and then we will have 1.4 interpreting the Declaration. I do want to remind you that we have a concept check tomorrow over 1.4, excuse me, 1.1 and 1.4. So we can't talk about the Declaration of Independence without first speaking about how North Carolina has kind of brought themselves into the conversation. And they have done so by two resolves or resolutions. So in 1775, Mecklenburg County residents decide to pass the Mecklenburg Resolves. This basically said that British laws are no longer in effect in Mecklenburg County, and that we don't need, or Charlotte didn't need, the British to govern them. Instead, we were more than capable of governing ourselves. Okay, this document didn't necessarily call for a revolution or call for independence from Britain, but it did say essentially that we want to be on our own. And the only way to do that is to make our own laws. Next, about a year later, we have the Halifax Resolves. And this took place in Halifax, North Carolina. And this was the very first call for independence from Britain. Okay, this was the very first call for independence from Britain. This was huge. This was unprecedented at the time. And then, in 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. We will watch a video in a little while that kind of tells us that, hey, there was a little bit more to it than just Thomas Jefferson penning it on July 3rd, 1776. And by third, there is a meme that is a picture of Thomas Jefferson, and he's sitting at this old table, and he looks like he has writer's block, and he's holding this feather quill pen, and he says, "What? It's due tomorrow?" And the date is July 3rd, 1776. And we'll find out that that ultimately isn't true because Congress actually had the Declaration of Independence on July 2nd. And then they voted on it and kind of reviewed it for 2 days, which Jefferson did not like at all. But we'll come to that in a little while. So the Declaration of Independence did several things, okay? First off, it explained why the colonies wanted to separate from Britain. This was huge because remember back to our philosophers. None of them said, hey, if you want to have a revolution, go ahead and revolt. Nobody said that. Instead, there had to be cause. And the Declaration of Independence was basically a document that is presenting evidence to both the British and the world, and a little bit to the colonists as well, why the colonies should separate from Britain. Next, it listed all of the things that the king did wrong, or all the wrongs suffered under King George III. So again, the wrongs, let's think about King George taking away the right to a trial by jury. Think about King George instituting the Quartering Act. Think about the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts. All of the wrongs, and these can all probably be traced back to the idea of taxation without representation, and King George kind of forcing the colonists to repay the debt incurred during the French and Indian War. So again, they're explaining why in the Declaration the colonies needed to separate from Britain. They are listing all of the things that King George did wrong, and then they're also listing the rights the newly independent states would have. So again, we're talking about John Locke here. We're talking about all of the things that Locke tells us we need in order to have a revolution. Okay, we're building our case for revolution, and then we're also saying, hey, once we are free, we are going to have these rights. We are entitled to these unalienable rights. And this is going to be approved on July 4th, 1776. We're going to come back to that. I don't know. Let's see. Bear with me, guys. Bear with me.
One of the best pieces of writing I've ever seen. It's a
One moment. I am trying my best, guys.
Thomas Jefferson's writing is the Declaration of Independence, for me, is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever seen.
It's a revolutionary document for a revolutionary statement.
You cannot help but be stirred when you read those words.
Thomas Jefferson's writing is absolutely magnificent. When he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That was the first time anybody had bothered to write that down.
And then you turn the clock back and think of when he was writing, how young he was, what a statement it was, given the history of the world at that point. And you feel the excitement of being on the cusp of something so profound that it's hard to put it into words.
If you review our Declaration of Independence, it has those beautiful words about all men are created equal and governments are formed among men to represent the people. It's a good statement of what we're all about. And that's the only thing people remember about the Declaration of Independence, that it was about all men are created equal. But it's really a roughly a 28 count indictment against King George. And therefore, because of the way in which the British Crown treated us, we now declare that we are a free country, and we want to let you know why. Now, we're going to have a war. We're going to have a war.
In 1776, you have the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, debating a unified position for the colonies with respect to the hostilities that have already broken out. And the fundamental issue between them is, are they fighting for their rights as Englishmen within the British Empire, or are they going to fight for independence? And they're seriously divided. People who are perfectly willing to resist the tyranny of the British government are not necessarily willing to strike for independence. But there's a groundswell in favor of it, I think, in large measure because they recognize that having provoked the lion this far, there's no going back.
All of a sudden, you have this group of people who are going, no, we're not part of some great chain of being with the king at the top of it. We are free people. We can vote for who we want to have in charge. And we're not going to tolerate you telling us that we have some class status we have to be trapped in. It says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, meaning that Parliament in London, the King himself, the courts cannot interfere and take away your rights because the state can't take power from us. So even to this day, it's probably the most central difference between America and every other country in the world.
It goes well beyond what was needed in order to declare independence. It establishes a philosophical basis for a civil democracy in which all persons are guaranteed rights by virtue of their personhood.
This political genius, not just in Jefferson, but in Adams and all the other people who collected here, they saw a new time for humankind, which is that we can be free and that we can make decisions for ourselves.
All right. So I think that is a really good place to kind of think about what the Declaration did, why it was so very important, and that it wasn't just a document, okay? It was seen as the foundational stone or the cornerstone of what the American Revolution was going to be about. It was going to be about rights. It was going to be about freedoms. And it was going to be about maintaining or creating legitimacy as a new nation. All right, so we have one more video. And when we watch this one, I want you to think about kind of why maybe we didn't know some of these facts. So this is about little known facts within the Declaration.
All men are created equal, and they are endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not so fast, Mr. Jefferson. These words from the Declaration of Independence and the facts behind them are well known. In June of 1776, a little more than a year after the war against England began with the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia to discuss American independence. After long debates, a resolution of independence was approved on July 2nd, 1776. America was free, and men like John Adams thought we would celebrate that date forever. But it was 2 days later that the gentlemen in Congress voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, offering all the reasons why the country should be free. More than 235 years later, we celebrate that day as America's birthday. But there are some pieces of the story you may not know. First of all, Thomas Jefferson gets the credit for writing the Declaration, but 5 men had been given the job to come up with a document explaining why America should be independent. Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were all named first. And it was Adams who suggested that the young and little-known Thomas Jefferson join them, because they needed a man from the influential Virginia delegation, and Adams thought Jefferson was a much better writer than he was. Second, though Jefferson never used footnotes or credited his sources, some of his memorable words and phrases were borrowed from other writers and slightly tweaked. Then Franklin and Adams offered a few suggestions, but the most important change came after the Declaration was turned over to the full Congress. For 2 days, a very unhappy Thomas Jefferson sat and fumed while his words were picked over. In the end, the Congress made a few minor word changes and one big deletion. In the long list of charges that Jefferson made against the King of England, the author of the Declaration had included the idea that George III was responsible for the slave trade and was preventing America from ending slavery. That was not only untrue, but Congress wanted no mention of slavery in the nation's founding document. The reference was cut out before the Declaration was approved and sent to the printer. But it leaves open the hard question: how could the men who were about to sign a document celebrating liberty and equality accept a system in which some people owned others? It is a question that would eventually bring the nation to civil war, and one we can still ask today.
All right. So, I mean, think about it, right? And we're talking about Enlightenment ideals. we are talking about kind of what the Enlightenment thinkers told us about rights. We're celebrating a document that has to do specifically with new rights, with new freedoms, with new liberties. And we're still kind of sidestepping around this slavery issue. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But I wanted to show you what was actually written in the draft that Thomas Jefferson proposed to Congress. Okay, so it says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death. So take a moment to think, why do you think this statement was not included in the final draft of the Declaration? Obviously, we heard in the video that it wasn't completely accurate in terms of kind of seeing this whole quote as King George III perpetuating slavery and not allowing the United States, or what would become the colonies, to kind of stop contributing or stop participating in the slave trade. So go ahead and pause me for a second and think about why this may not have been in the final draft of the Declaration. Okay, so I hope you paused me a minute ago and kind of took some time to really think about why that specific section was omitted from the Declaration of Independence. But I want you to think even harder in another minute. So knowing what you do about Locke, about Jefferson, about King George III, and the writing of the Declaration of Independence, okay? And this goes back to the video we just watched. How did the founders, who were about to sign a document celebrating liberty and equality, accept a system in which some people owned others? So we really have to think about that, right? And I want you to write in your notes right now, because we are going to talk about this tomorrow, because I think it is a fundamental question that we need to answer for ourselves in 2020, because we can't move forward until we have an answer to this question. And I will kind of preview it by saying the answer to this question will probably not be satisfying, okay? The answer will not give us the closure or the explanation that we hope in such a divided, politicized time in our country. But we are going to talk about it tomorrow. So think about this. All right, next. You know, again, like I told you, we have to talk about Charlotte. Because North Carolina and Charlotte specifically was very kind of was very prominent in the American Revolution, though we don't really hear a lot about it because most of the battles in and around Charlotte were not that significant. But I think because we live here, we owe it to ourselves to kind of know where Charlotte sat in the American Revolution and also the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to start with the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So the fighting occurred here in Greensboro. This was a huge defeat for the British, also a huge victory for the Americans. This came at a really pivotal point in the American Revolution that allowed the colonists to gain more confidence in their abilities as both now, I guess, militiamen or professional members of the army, because as we are kind of going along in the American Revolution, the colonists are becoming more familiar and more trained and more disciplined. So we do see this as a big kind of boost to the morale and American confidence. Next, in 1780, we have the Battle at Charlotte, where the British troops of Lord Charles Cornwallis, so we know Cornwallis, he and the colonists kind of get into this skirmish. And at the time, Charlotte wasn't big, right? It was kind of a very small town. It was a crossroads, and Cornwallis spent 16 humiliating days in Charlotte. And legend has it, I guess, that he was heard saying as they prepared to leave, "Let's get out of here. This place is a damned hornet's nest." And so, kind of from here on out, Charlotte has this new nickname of being a hornet's nest. So, also kind of in the Battle of Charlotte, it had pretty low strategic value. Okay, but it really did foreshadow the difficulties that Cornwallis was going to have, especially in the Carolina back country. And this would ultimately lead us to the catastrophe at Yorktown about a year later, where Cornwallis surrendered himself and about 8,000 troops to the great General George Washington. So during our asynchronous time today, I want you to go ahead and do two things. The first thing that I want you to do is listen to the Declaration of Independence video. And I want you to think about the words used. Think about the language. Think about whether or not it is assertive. Is it persuasive? Is it accusatory? What vibe are the words kind of perpetuating as you listen to the document? Now, the second thing I want you to do is I want you to complete 1.4, interpreting the Declaration of Independence. And as a reminder, I'm asking you for a paragraph. Okay, a paragraph is not 3 sentences. And also, as a reminder, I am grading you on both correctness and effort. We have now spent a solid amount of time talking about the Declaration of Independence, talking about the intricacies, talking about different quotes, that you should have a solid grasp on what is going on. So please, if you want full credit, remember you are graded on correctness and effort. All right, that's all for today. Thanks.